So I'm recording my homily for the 15th Sunday in Ordinary Time, and we had a great gospel this weekend, a very long gospel. So it was the parable of the sower and the seed. And this is a gospel that Jesus is going to refer to in many ways. He's gonna hearken back to the idea of the seed being sown, and so whether the seed is dying the way he needed to die, as in the resurrection, or focusing on the sower, the one who's sowing the word of God, or we could even say the love of God into people's hearts and minds. And so there's various takes that he'll use on this whole theme. And so I'm going to focus a little bit differently today. So in my last assignment, one of the very last families I went to have dinner with was some farmers up in the Burlington, Mount Vernon area. And when I was having dinner with them, they were telling me about all the different things that go into farming these days, and they're extremely scientific, extremely precise. It was amazing to me. There was times it was like they understood all the chemistry behind, whether it was the plants or the soils or even the pesticides or the illnesses and the diseases that would afflict the plants. And I guess I just never thought about how scientific it was. And to me, it was almost like they were doctors. They were doctors of these plants that they were trying to grow for food. And so I think in some ways I want to use that to shed light on the parable. And so it's like if these farmers were almost like doctors, then I think Jesus wants us to be like spiritual farmers or spiritual doctors. That when we look at what afflicts the seed that's sown inside of us and the love of God and His grace that's planted in us, that there's things that afflict it, there's things that can harm it. And we see that in the different types of soils in our parable today. And so just to go in it a little bit, but I want to talk about it in terms of woundedness. And so the things that can wound us, which then subsequently wound our ability to receive God in our lives. But before I say that, people sometimes ask me where I film my videos. So this, if you remember last year, if you've seen my videos last year, I filmed it out by Pacific Beach. And so this has been 1 year anniversary. I'm back out here. So my family is doing a little family reunion out here. We do it every year. And so I broke away for the morning and just filming my homily. So this is just north of Pacific Beach. And it's an old Coast Guard station, and so I just came out here towards the edge here, and it's a very, very beautiful day. So the different types of soil. So the first type of soil is the hardened path, right? So it's the soil that's been hardened because people walk on it, because carriages roll over it, because it's used for something other than farming. It's not meant to grow anything per se. It's meant for people to walk on. But if you try to grow something, it just won't take it. And so that's the first type of soil that Jesus wants us to focus on. Okay, so the hardened path, nothing can get in. God's word can't get in, nothing can get in. The second type of soil is the rocky ground. And so the rocky ground it's not like the path, because the soil's softer, so it's not getting beaten down, but the problem is the boulders, it's the rocks. And so there's some ways in which in our own lives we have these boulders, and the boulders themselves are harder than the path, right? The soil that's been beaten down. And so boulders, you can't farm through boulders. If I were to ask the farmers up in the Burlington area, can you run your machinery if there's boulders in the field? And they say, no, we have to remove the boulders, okay? So that's the second type of soil. The third type of soil is the thorns. And this is where the soil is okay, but there's something more subtle going on. The farmer, or I say, if in terms of ourselves, there was something that we've done in a not necessarily like a really bad way, but very subtle. It's very subtle how we allow things into our life that will then choke God off in terms of Him working in our life. And then you have the fourth type of soil, which is the good soil. All right, so I'm going to go back through these real quick and just draw some analogy of woundedness. And so what's like the hardened path? What is the hardened path in terms of woundedness? Well, you think of a child who grows up in a home where there's some type of abuse, whether it's emotional abuse or physical abuse. Children do what we all do when we're being hurt. We shrink back and we harden. We protect ourselves, right? We put up a wall to protect our heart. And we do that because we don't want to get hurt again. And so we harden ourselves off. But what we don't really realize that we're doing is we're also protecting ourselves unintentionally from love. Because if we're not vulnerable, we can't receive love and we can't give love. And so the hardened path then won't allow good in, just like it won't allow bad in. And so that then becomes part of the problem. There's a type of abuse, though, that we don't often talk about that, and that's spiritual abuse. And so when a child grows up in a family where the parents don't pray with their kids, or they don't bring their kids to church, or they don't do anything spiritual, they don't show them by their example a love for God, there's a form of spiritual abuse that is happening to those children. I can't tell you how many kids that I run into just in the general population, not necessarily in the parish, but just out and about. And if I have an opportunity to start talking to them about faith, there's just no concept. There's no concept of Jesus. They have no clue who Jesus even is. And so that is a form of spiritual abuse. It's spiritual neglect, right? And so parents that pray together, parents that pray with their children, parents that love God will teach about God in a very loving and affectionate manner. And so for children to grow up in that type of home, it's very different. And you'll see that in children. You'll see their eyes just brighten up when you start talking about faith because there's already a love planted there. Okay, so really watching out in our families for any type of spiritual abuse. Maybe we've endured it, or maybe we are now, in some ways, maybe even unintentionally inflicting that on others, where we're afraid to go deeper spiritually and to express love with our children, or maybe we just don't know how to do it. And so that's the first type of soil that Jesus wants to warn us of and say, be mindful of that. That's the hardened path where nothing's getting in. Okay? A little example of that. So Gandhi, who was very much a revered leader in India many years ago, tried to teach his people how to deal with an oppressive body. And this, at that time, it was the British Empire. And he used the Gospels as his foundation for how to engage this oppressive force, which was basically turning his people into slaves, or at the very least not treating them as equals. And so part of it was to resist, but the other part of it was to always show love. And he would say that he used the Gospels as his guide for that. And so the Christian missionaries at the time would ask him and say, well, if you're using the Gospels and you're not Catholic, you're not Christian, why don't you become Christian if it's so important for you? And he said point blankly, he said, because I've never met a Christian who actually lived it. Because you have to remember, the people who are bringing the gospel to him were also part of this body of people that was basically enslaving his people. And so the problem was the soil got hardened for him because of the poor example of the people. So he could see the gospel, he could understand the gospel, it was attractive to him, it was truth, but the poor example hardened the soil, and so he never converted because of the poor example. But you know he wanted to, because he used it for his own beliefs. Okay, the rocky ground. So the rocky ground, I think, a little more modern example of that. And this is the boulders, this is the rocks. And so this is the things that are like mortal sins in our life. That it's not like it's all rocky ground, but there's enough boulders to really hinder anything from growing and any fruit from developing. And so addictions is a perfect example. Whatever type of addictions, drugs, alcohol, pornography, anything that's going to hinder our families from really being able to go deep with Jesus. And so it's the mortal sins. It's the sins that are really serious. It's the sins that unless we remove them, they will not permit God to work in our life. And in families, again, we can have those things. They're like the elephant in the middle of the living room. We're afraid to talk about it, or we're afraid to offend people, or whatever it may be. But until those rocks are removed, the family can't go deeper. And so to be mindful and say, okay, in my own life, in my family's life, in my parish, what are the boulders that are hindering us from allowing God's fruit to work? Okay, so it's to be mindful. And those addictions, those things are very much a part of our culture. And so there is going to be a battle. It's not going to be easy to remove them. Well, it never has been easy. The third type of field, the weeds. I saw a survey a couple years ago, and it outlined the different Christian denominations, and so it divided them up, and it asked people of these different denominations, including us as Catholics, what our beliefs are on the moral issues, and then how we're actually living our life. And they found that in all the Christian denominations, except one, in all of them, we had our traditional Christian beliefs, but we basically lived our lives according to the culture. In other words, it didn't shape our actions in any way. We reflected the culture. The one exception were the Mormons. They were the only ones who actually lived according to their beliefs and were living in a countercultural way. Now, I don't want you to hear this and go become Mormon, all right? That's not the point of this. But it was that there was an integrity that they have maintained according to their beliefs. When Jesus talks to us about the thorns, the weeds that grow up, he wants us to be mindful about having integrity, that these beliefs that we have, they're not just things that we intellectually assent to. They're meant to shape and form our lives. And actually, they're meant to shape and form our culture and everybody around us as well. This is what we evangelize. What changes our behavior and conforms our whole life to God. That needs to happen. And so if we allow the subtle things, now these are not the mortal sins, these are the subtle things that just make us lukewarm, that just choke us off. So what are some examples? Now these are good things, but these are things that if they are put over our faith, they will choke our faith off. Many parents put academics before faith with their children. They will tell them to work hard on their schoolwork, and their kids will work hours a day on schoolwork, and they'll go to great high schools and they'll go to great colleges and universities to get great jobs. And that's all great. But if that is a higher priority than faith, then the thorns are already growing. And the kids will leave the faith because they're just higher. And so the problem with the thorns is when anything is placed higher than God. A couple years ago, I had a little mission at one of the little parishes, and every October it was hunting season, and I was warned that all the men would go hunting during the month of October, and I would never see them at Mass. And sure enough, October rolls around, and all the men are gone. It's like it's only women at Mass during October. So I would talk to some of the men about that afterwards, and I would ask them, I would say, so tell me a little bit about the hunting. And the hunting was just for sport. It was not, these are not mountain men who were providing meat for their families through the winter. They're not going to starve to death, okay? It was for sport. And so I'd ask them, I would say, now, do you think that it's okay to miss Mass to go hunting? And they didn't like that question because they knew the answer, but they were still choosing something over faith. And so whether they intended to do it or not, they were teaching their teenage boys the example that that's how they were going to grow up. That's what they were going to do. That hunting is more important, sport hunting is more important than faith. So then I would talk to them a little bit more, and I would say, so why don't you go hunting during the week instead of on the weekends so you could be here for Mass? And they said, well, we have jobs. I said, well, why don't you just ditch work? And they would say, well, Father, we can't do that. We'd get fired. So really what you're saying is that not just hunting is more important than faith, but your jobs are more important as well. So now Jesus has just gone from being second to now he's third. Now, what about some of the other things that come up, like your kids' sport? Not your kids, but kids' sports. They have a tournament and they have sporting events on Sunday mornings, and all of a sudden faith very easily becomes fifth and sixth and seventh. And in that progression, it's only a matter of time before God is last, and only comes when it's convenient. That's the weeds. That's what Jesus is warning us of. 2,000 years ago, the issues were still the same. It's lukewarmness. It's people choosing something over God. A little example, St. Kateri, we celebrated her feast day this last week, and we had a big celebration for her at St. Anne's over in Tulalip, and it was beautiful. I love the Mass. It was very beautiful. And just a little bit about St. Kateri's life. So when she was 4 years old, she contracted smallpox. And she survived, but she was very wounded by it. She had scars on her face. It affected her eyesight for her whole life. In fact, her name, Tekekwitha, means one who bumps into things, because she grew up not being able to see very well. And you think about it, that's like naming a kid Four Eyes, right? It's kind of an insult. It's picking on the kid, at least in my opinion. And so there's already, even from the age of 4, she has reasons to have hardened soil. She has reasons to not really love God. But to compound that, when she got smallpox at the age of 4, her parents did as well, and they both died from it. And not only that, one of her siblings also died. Now, can you imagine being a 4-year-old coming down with an illness that kills your parents? Now, you know how children process that? What a child does is they make connections. And the connection that she could have easily made was that she had an illness that killed her parents. She could struggle with just horrible feelings of guilt, even feeling like she was responsible in some way for it. That's what kids do. She had every reason to hate God. She had every reason to do what we do when we get mad with God, to become promiscuous, to turn to drugs or alcohol, or to just to turn away from faith, or just to become embittered. She had every reason to do that, and she did none of that. She loved God. And so I want to offer a thought why she was able to have such good soil in her soul, even with all that. Now, I'm going to add to it even a little bit. When she got older and converted to the Catholic faith, she chose to become a consecrated virgin. And that's not a term we use very often in the Catholic Church, but we still have them. When a young woman wants to consecrate herself, her life to God in that particular manner, and so that's obviously not to marriage, and it's not necessarily to a religious order, but it's to consecrate her life so that she would never marry, so that she could give her life to God. And she chose to do that. And when she did that, the culture of her tribe was very hostile to that. And so she was rejected for doing that. Now, why did she love so much? There was a group of missionaries, French Jesuits, who were working amongst her tribe and other tribes during that time. And about 10 years before she was born, many of them were martyred. And there was one in particular, Father Isaac Jogues, who was brutally tortured. And he eventually escaped because they imprisoned him. And he escaped and went back to France to recover. And the torture was quite brutal. They had they had cut off his fingers. They had done all kinds of horrible things to him. And as he was recuperating, his superiors were planning to give him a rather easy assignment because of what he had gone through. And once he had recovered, he asked his superior if he could go back. Because he said, just very simply, he said, they are my people. And I wish to bring the good news to them, even if it means dying. And so his superior allowed him to go back. And so he crossed the ocean and came back, and he was eventually martyred. But Kateri is growing up in the midst of that. This, as we say, martyrdom is the seedbed of the church. she's growing up amidst people who are bringing the faith, and they're so passionate that they love their enemy. They're doing exactly what Jesus said, and they're doing it in such an affectionate way, even to the point of sacrificing themselves, exactly the same way Jesus did. And so she's going to have every opportunity to know what it means to have good soil, even in the midst of difficulty. So I just want to bring this all together. I think Jesus wants us to be spiritual farmers in the sense that not only do we want to have our own soil really good and able to grow great fruit, but he also wants us to be like spiritual doctors, where we can look at other people's lives and we can perceive into them and see and kind of diagnose when they have a hardened path, when they have boulders in their life, when they have weeds growing up, and not in judgment, but the desire to help them, to want them to have good soil like ourselves. And so when we are able to do that, when we have the competency, because we have good soil, we can then turn to our neighbor and love them as ourselves and help them also. All right. God bless.